Good evening, Eugene. How are you?
I'm great, Jana. How are you there?
Great. Well, week 28, we're here. The year is really going quickly. So we're at week 28 for what's not in the mainstream news. And it's a great way for busy people like ourselves to just watch a 30-minute catch up on what's happened over the last week. So we're at week 28. For those who haven't watched the last few weeks, you can find them on our Natural Women's Council YouTube channel on the playlist. And for those who haven't watched our podcast, I'm Jana London, founder of the Natural Women's Council, and Eugene Garvin is a retired director of engineering and does a lot of the research for the Natural Women's Council, Parents' Rights Alliance, Irish Education Alliance, and Lawyers for Justice. So, well, just before we start, Eugene, I'll take a moment just to read some comments. So, just looking at comments from last week, week 27, which talked about the corruption of stakeholder capitalism, activist scholarship, and the WEF leaders. Some comments we have are, I learned so much from your show, even though it is very scary stuff. Yes, it can be a bit of a red pill. Thank you for the work you put into your video. The Irish people are not yet aware of the danger they and their kids are in. Thanks to people like you, we're slowly getting there. We have another one that says, excellent material presented in a condensed manner for the busy person to digest. And another comment is, you two are amazing for keeping busy people up to speed on what's going on in the world. Such a service. You two are selfless people. Thank you. So thanks for all those great comments. Please do keep commenting so we can see what you want more of, less of, or just give us a comment to help us with the algorithm. So tonight we are, again, week 28. So I'll turn it over to you, Eugene, to talk about what's not in the mainstream news.
So the first one is the Scottish government being advised to halt puberty blockers. I guess this is just an extension of the kind of outcome of the CAS report, and it's great to see that that's been kind of taken on board in Scotland. Obviously, Scotland has a separate control over education to the rest of England. So what happens in England is different than Scotland, and Wales is different again. But good to see this, and it's just another confirmation of what was captured in the CAS report, and I guess we should be adopting that in Irish schools as well. So that's kind of the message.
On the naturalwomen'scouncil.ie website, we have a very detailed letter that we sent to every TD, minister, senator, children's ombudsman, and primary and secondary school asking for the gender ideology to be removed straight away based on the CAS report and the leaked WPATH files. So we would urge anyone listening to copy the letter, paste it in an email, and send it to the TDs and senators as well, so we can get the power of numbers. But there's no reason that Ireland should not follow suit as Scotland and England did.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So the next one is who is responsible for the books? So this is kind of an interesting one. And one of the retired teachers in our group actually, and a few people have been actually making queries regarding this, but they actually made a special request to Norma Foley's office on a number of issues. And one of them was with regard to the content of the actual school books, the classroom school books that you've got to see some examples there. You'll see some of the images of the covers. And we were trying to find out, well, who's responsible for them? And the response we got, which we'll kind of show you here, and is not a very satisfactory one. It's basically the Department of Education, and we also got a similar response from the NCCA, as in we're not the people responsible. It's actually the publishers of the books, and you need to get on to the publisher of the book if you have an issue with the book. So I just think this one is totally ridiculous. I mean, I've come from a background where sign off on something like this was something you'd expect, the department or the NCCA to be responsible for, and that you'd get a little sticker or something on the book saying that this was approved. And the next one, I guess, is where are the children? This has been a running issue for a while now with the number of missing children in the state, and there's been a noted increase in the number of underage minors arriving as well, migrants coming into the country. So this is only going to get worse, this situation, and it doesn't seem to be getting the publicity in the mainstream media that it warrants, because this is quite serious. And there's no follow-up, there's nobody investigating this thing, and the queries are going into Roderick O'Gorman and his department, and and we're not getting the answers.
So I would ask, why exactly is Minister O'Gorman and Minister McEntee ignoring this, covering it up? Why is that? Questions have to be asked.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And again, it does go back to the mainstream media. We'll come back to the mainstream media in the next section, but it does show you we have an issue in this country right now. And things are not being investigated. And if they're being investigated, it's certainly not being revealed to the public. So we're going to take stock in the next, the next 10, 15 minutes of where we are. And we're heading down a certain path right now, which I would say a lot of Irish people haven't bought into, and we're not even quite aware as to where it's going. If things don't change in the next election, I think the fear that we would have is that we're going to continue on this path and it's only going to get worse. So the first thing I want to put up here is a slide that was actually presented as part of the SPHE teacher training in DCU, which we were able to get hold of. And it's kind of an interesting slide. It shows kind of where they see Ireland now, that we're neoliberal, secular, morally relativist. Now that's terminology. You could also say postmodern. Now people might be that familiar with the term postmodern. We've used it before. We actually talked about it a little bit last week in last week's video in the context of critical social justice. But it basically, postmodern would mean things like objective truth. You wouldn't believe in objective truth anymore. It's subjective truth. Your truth, my truth. Postmodernism doesn't recognize what they call meta-narratives, things like biology and science, for example, and religion. They'd include in that, and even traditional Marxism would be considered a kind of a meta-narrative. And it's very taken up with language and the power of language. And the social construction of things like gender, for example. The postmodern view would be that gender is socially constructed. I'm not sure that a lot of Irish people would identify with postmodernism and would see themselves as holding postmodern views. They may see themselves as holding liberal views. And I think a lot of people in this country, and we've kind of see it by the timeline there, people about there's obviously been a liberal agenda, I guess, in this country that's been running. But postmodernism brings you into a different place, and that we talked about it in the last video, actually. And if you haven't seen it, you should probably go back. That when you marry postmodernism with a critical theory, Marxist critical theory, you end up with something very nasty indeed, which is in our academia at the moment, and is also being injected into our schools. So that's not good. So this, you can see where this is not a good starting point. If this is what we believe this country is right now, and you're going to implement policies and legislation and new curricula in the schools based on this, it's probably not going to be in line with a lot of people in the country. We're going to break it down into 3 sections: children, family, and the state as a whole. And we're going to look at what's impacting those based on what's been going on in this country. So the first issue, I think, is the indoctrination of children. And I'm also saying destabilizing children and youth. And what's contributing to that? Well, the curricula, the over-sexualization, the politicization, and the overall indoctrination. And we've seen it in the junior cycle. Like we've had 1 year of it in the junior cycle, and we've seen it in the curriculum for the primary curriculum, the draft primary curriculum. And it's probably even worse there, and that's a younger cohort of children. So we've definitely got into the indoctrination business in Irish schools now, similar to Maoist China or Russia or any of these other totalitarian type regimes, North Korea. So where does that come from? Well, I suppose we've explored some of that in some of the previous videos, but it's definitely happening, and we can see it in the curriculum, we can see it in the school books. Now, it's taking time to get implemented because our teachers, thankfully, most of our teachers are pretty normal. They're not postmodern, and they're not bought into a lot of this. So it's going to take time to indoctrinate the teachers as well. There's a group called EJA, OIDE. They're a relatively new group. They're the teacher training group. And that's what they're setting about doing right now. And they're already indoctrinating teachers to use ungendered language, non-heteronormative language, to use the pronouns. So they're already doing that at the teacher level. And there's a lot more to come. And we know that critical race theory is on its way because we've seen that in the news recently. So that's one issue. The other issues are
And
obviously
Eugene, just to
in
let
line
our
with that is
listeners
this.
know, we
Yeah.
have a teacher who was on this DCU course who is actually coming out as a whistleblower and will
Yep.
be filming a short documentary in August. So we'll post the link to that fundraiser in the comments as well.
People will say this is not in our school, or we haven't seen this in our school this year. Yeah, thank God you haven't. And I'm really happy for you. But you can be damn sure it's coming, because this stuff is going to be obligatory. They're going to be doing tests on schools. The inspectors are going to be checking this out in schools. There's a very rigid kind of regime going to be put in place to make sure that schools toe the line on this.
Yep.
And obviously from a teacher training perspective and also an inspection perspective. So
And
thank God you didn't have it this year.
chances are, any of you listening who are parents, you actually won't know it's happening because your child will be signing a secrecy pact where they're not allowed to tell you what they learn in the classroom.
So let's move on. So the other issues that we have here is this whole affirmative care model, because they're teaching gender ideology in schools, and then when children express gender confusion, they're socially transitioning in the school. They're affirming them. And in light of the CAS report that we just talked about, that should not be happening. So there's a bill, and we'll talk about it a little bit later on in more detail, but there's a bill to ban conversion therapy. So what do we mean by conversion therapy? Well, we kind of know about gay conversion therapy, but specifically in this context, it's conversion therapy with regard to gender identity. So if a child expresses gender confusion, they think they're a girl or they think they're a boy or whatever it is, you're supposed to affirm that. You're not allowed to let them undergo psychoanalysis. And that might potentially resolve their gender confusion, because that's considered conversion therapy. So it's a huge issue. This is in place in Canada, and it's in a number of other countries. Talk about that specific bill later on. Most people don't know it exists. So the other issues we have with our children, there's been a massive mental health crisis in this country that's carried over from COVID, and we probably even had it before that. And we've numbers in excess of 4,000 children in 2023 still waiting for state care. And I don't know what the number is this year. Haven't seen the official numbers, but there's a huge backlog. I don't believe it's got any better. I would hazard to guess it's got much worse, actually, because it was increasing dramatically at that time. And obviously we did have a carryover from COVID. So that's a mental health crisis affecting children. And it does carry over into the whole transgender thing, because some of those mental health issues for those children could be resulting in them having gender confusion as well. So there's an overlap there. The removal of parental opt-outs. Again, when we talk about the legislation, there is actually a piece of legislation in there to remove the opt-out based on the ethos of the school. So right now, schools of a particular religious ethos or whatever ethos it is can opt out and have a different curriculum to cover areas that would not be compatible with their ethos and beliefs. And there's a bill before the Dáil, and again, we'll talk about it a little bit later on, that seeks to override that. And there's also been murmurings in the Dáil from various people over the last couple of years talking that they would like to see any sort of opt-out at all removed. And so that willingness seems to be there. It's with the hard left, as we would call them. But the problem is most of our government right now is hard left. Some are more vocal than others. So it's the kind of people before profit and people like that you would hear uttering this in the Dáil. But this is a real possibility. And there is a bill, as I say, to remove the restriction based on ethos. So more in a little while. The other thing is the degradation of learning. And this is the concern that we raised with regard to the primary curriculum. Because when you bring in all this over-sexualization, politicization, and the overall indoctrination, so it's the subjects of SPHE, well-being, and the CSPE curriculum, they have basically pushed out other subjects. And then when you start adopting the whole school kind of mechanism where you bring in themes of inclusion, global citizenship, or whatever it is, when you bring those themes into other subjects, you're contaminating those subjects and you're diluting the actual academic achievement in the class and what you're actually covering. So ultimately, you're degrading the learning experience. And people have started expressing concerns over this, particularly teachers. And again, we talked about that in one of the previous videos.
We can opt out, but with the new curriculum, they're going to be putting this social justice, Marxism, transgenderism, indoctrination into every subject. So opting out as we are allowed to do, will really be quite pointless because it is going to infiltrate every subject. So if you were to opt out, your child wouldn't be in school at all for the day.
In totalitarian political systems, you've got to indoctrinate the children. It's an essential part. You've got to get the children on side with all of the kind of policies and ideologies that you want to adopt and run with.
Mhm.
The next area is the area of the family. And again, we've got a whole load of things kind of attacking the family, if I call it that. The whole area of third and fourth wave feminism obviously affects relationships in general and affects the family. And that also brought in the whole notion of your socially constructed gender. And again, that's a disruption to the family. We had the family and care referendum. Thankfully, it was defeated, but that was an attack on the family. We all too aware of that. The whole area of assisted human reproduction and the surrogacy bill, and it's a particularly liberal surrogacy bill, which does not respect the institution of family as we would understand it. So they basically kind of opened it up very broadly in the whole surrogacy thing. It's not restricted to, your typical family structure. So again, those are attacks on the family, and they're done. They've been
And
signed off.
the surrogacy bill doesn't discriminate if you're a sex offender or a single man and you want to buy a child. So that's how liberal it
No,
is.
no, doesn't. Yep, yeah. Assisted dying, we know that's in the works. There's been, and we'll have links to any of the legislation stuff. We'll put those in the description. So that's still in progress, and again, that's an attack on the family in different ways. The accommodation crisis, huge issue. Young people unable to get accommodation, so they can't they can't get married and have a family home. They don't have enough room for children, so they restrict how many children that they have. It's a huge issue, again, a huge attack on the family. And right now, fundamentally, the government are not doing enough on this. Their agenda is in other places. You can see it. This is not something they're prioritizing, and they're only making the problem worse, obviously, with the uncontrolled migration. So, this is one that unfortunately the government have created a problem here, and it's persisting, and they're not resolving it. There's also, again, a general mental health issue at an older level, and that affects everybody. And again, that does affect the family. And there's the exodus of young Irish people. So people who just can't, young people who can't afford to live here, and they see the price of houses here, they see the cost of living, and they get out. They get out at a young age. They decide it's better to go to Australia or somewhere else and leave the country. And a lot of them don't come back. The liberal abortion laws, we had over 10,000 abortions last year in Ireland. It's way higher than we thought it would be. Those numbers are much higher than we thought they would be. And again, driven by different things, but again, it's not family friendly. That's it obviously isn't. And then the erasure of the Catholic religion, which is a supporting structure of the family. And there's some people in Dáil Éireann who have I would say, nearly a vendetta against the church. Like they would go out of their way to do things against the church. There's no doubt about that. There's a certain attitude out there. Academia right now is a very different place than it was when I was going through college. And it is being captured by these radical postmodern theories, or wokeness, if you want to call it that. But it's a very different place. So that's done and dusted. Corporate stakeholder capitalism. We talked about it in our last two videos. We've huge corporations in this country. They're all bought into this. They're all bought into transgenderism, LGBTQ rights, climate action, any of them that are bought into stakeholder capitalism. And we have all the big ones here, and they all are. So that's a huge influence in this country because all the employees in those companies are also getting effectively a level of indoctrination in their company, because they're going to have to go through things like diversity, equity, inclusion classes. They're going to have to go through racial equity classes, that kind of thing. So that's happening at a corporate level. Our military and navy is totally degraded. So people have been leaving it in droves. The numbers have declined. We don't have any sort of viable navy now. We don't have any viable military now. From a national perspective, this is outrageous. We can't defend our waters even. We have to rely on the UK to help defend some of our sea area. This is crazy. This should never have happened in a country. And again, this has been allowed to degrade for whatever reason, to make us dependent on military pacts, I guess, with Europe, which we see are happening. So again, that's it. That's done. We're not in a good place. The mainstream media, the capture of the mainstream media, their alignment with the political narrative of the day. It's there for all to see. I don't think I need to say any more. That's done and dusted. They're done and paid for. The captured NGO sector, this massive, over 6 billion euro every year on this totally far left NGO sector we have. It should be an election issue, to be honest. The civic and social organizational capture or ideological capture, again, the same thing has happened. All of these woke ideologies are in all our main institutions, institutions of the state and other voluntary institutions. So again, it's ongoing, but it's effectively there. And then the loss of native talent. So these are people, it's not just young people leaving the country. There's qualified doctors, qualified nurses, qualified teachers in their 30s saying, I'm out of here. It's too expensive to live here. And they're probably also saying, I don't like the way this country is going. Like, let's be honest. If you're a teacher right now, for example, you're probably thinking, I want to get out of here because I don't want to be teaching this stuff in the school. And if you're a doctor in a hospital, you're probably going to say, well, I don't want to be dealing with some of the woke stuff that's coming into the hospitals. So we're losing people, really good people. On the other side, we've got the pandemic treaty. Thankfully, that's kind of delayed right now. But that was an attempt at basically seizing a level of autonomy and control from this country. And I'm sure it's going to come back. We have the whole issue of the uncontrolled excessive mass migration. We just approved the EU treaty for that. So I just expect more of the same and potentially worse. Digital currency, that's been worked at an EU level, hasn't hit us yet, but I'm sure we'll be top of the class looking to be one of the first adopters once that's ready to roll. So environmental, we can see this. We can see the discussions regarding agriculture in this country and the potential proposals there. So this is happening. This is in progress. Lack of democratic opposition. We've had that for God knows how long. We've really struggled. Right now, we don't have a viable opposition in the Dáil that can keep the government honest. And that's a huge problem. Like that's you've got a serious problem in your democracy when you have that. So social credit is delayed because it's China are behind on their schedule. So that's going to take a few years to happen. But and we'll probably have a whole discussion as to what that is. But basically, again, that's a control mechanism. If you're not doing what you should be doing, if you're speaking out against the government or speaking out against government policy or whatever, basically you'll have a low social credit, and that will restrict your ability in terms of what you can do, what you can spend your money on, where you can go, all that kind of thing. So, and the last one here is compelled and censored speech. We don't need I say any more. The whole hate speech legislation.
If you want to go into the Free Speech Ireland website, freespeechireland.ie, I think it is .ie. They have a petition as well, but they've been doing great work on the promotion of free speech. I've been to a couple of their large events at Trinity and also the RDS.
So we'll give some examples of some of the issues with the kind of collusion between the government and our mass media here, and the whole issue of the stabbing last year, and Warren Donahue, who was the main first responder to that. He was the guy who got the knife off the perpetrator, and he's nearly the forgotten man. He was covered all right in some low profile cases. He was covered in the Daily Mirror, actually, in the UK, and with a regional version of the Independent, but he didn't get the mainstream coverage that the guy from the Deliveroo guy from Brazil got, who everybody knew and was a hero, and met with the Taoiseach at the time, Leo Varadkar. So here we had the Irish hero was unsung because he was Irish and he was white. And so I've got a summary view of all of what we talked about here, which looks pretty scary when you put it all together. And the other 2 points I want to make here is from an economic perspective, and we've got some links talking about this later on. We're hugely dependent on the multinationals, and we have a very large national debt. So we are not in a good place, because that having a large national debt and this dependency means you're beholden to other people. You're beholden to the people you've got the borrowing from, and you're beholden to these multinationals who are all bought into this stakeholder capital model, it's capitalism model. So we are compromised as a state because of that. So keep that in mind as well, because that's kind of something that could we could see where that is coming from in the future. So I'll talk about the legislation, Gender Recognition Act 2015. There was an amendment to that in 2017. We'll skip through these. These are done deals, as we know.
Mhm.
Then there's a bill from 2018, which is interesting, introduced by people like Ruth Coppinger and Paul Murphy. Surprise, surprise. Provision of objective sex education. This was basically a bill to override the characteristic spirit or ethos of schools in introducing sex education. No, it hasn't passed through the door. It's kind of sitting there in limbo. And hopefully it doesn't go any further. But just to make you aware, most people don't know that that bill exists. The next one is the hate speech bill, as we know too well, which is all about, it's more about putting the fear into you of the police coming to your door and taking away all your computing devices, etc., and looking through all your material. You know, they've got access to everything that you have on your devices, basically, because you'll have to give them the passwords. So I think that's enough it's a chilling effect on people to basically shut them up. And, you know, ultimately, if you're a Marxist on the far left, hate speech is anything that disagrees with your opinion. Like that's how they think, that's how it's worded. And we'll talk about that in a minute, actually. We'll talk about that. So it's not just that you were saying something nasty about a migrant or a trans person or something like that. If you're a Marxist, anybody on the right saying anything against you is hate speech. That's the reality. And here it is. We'll talk about it. Herbert Marcuse, one of the Frankfurt School Marxists, right? And he wrote a paper, Repressive Tolerance. And it's all about you tolerate everything from the left and you don't tolerate anything from the right. It's from these aggressive, crazy far right people. Anything that's not in agreement with what is actually far left ideologies and beliefs. And you can just see it. This is the mindset of the left, of the Marxist left, and it's as true in 2024 as it was in 1965 when Herbert Marcuse wrote this. He makes references to people on the right, you know, comparing them to fascists and Nazis, and again we hear that language being used by the far left. It's
And
typical
it's
language
it's
they
so
use.
inverted, and the irony must be mentioned that, you know, people like us who believe in free speech and free thinking and challenging things and being critical thinkers, we're called fascists because we want free speech and be able to have our own views. I mean, that is the most hypocritical sort of inverted
Yeah, it is.
approach
It is.
I could
Yeah.
imagine.
The next thing we're going to cover is the Irish Prohibition of Conversion Therapies Bill 2018, which we alluded to earlier on. But the real issue here is they brought gender identity into the scope. And that means that a young child, as I say, who has gender confusion, you cannot provide the proper care to that child, psychological care, because that could be interpreted as conversion therapy. And a very high probability that that child is going to undergo medicalization and, you know, all that goes with that in terms of sterility, etc., unnecessarily because they were not properly investigated. And worse still, they may even have other serious mental health issues, which would be discovered if you did have a proper psychological evaluation. And in not discovering those, that child could have a very high suicidality rate, not related to any gender confusion, but related to the actual other traumas or whatever that they were experiencing, which you're now not allowed to investigate. It's in place in Canada already. They've had it for a while. And actually, the Canadians have gone one step further. Not only do you have to affirm it, and the parents have to affirm the child. If they don't affirm the child, they're attempting to engage in, you know, psychological evaluation, which would be conversion therapy. So they'd be guilty of that. And if they're not affirming the child, they could have their child taken off them by Child Protective Services and also face prosecution. That's Canadian law.
It's absolute reckless malpractice to think that a doctor would not be allowed to explore the underlying issues for those gender confused children and just has to affirm them. I mean, that is just unbelievable. It's switching the responsibility from the parent to the government, to the state, and that's not what any parent should want.
Yeah, no, and that goes back to what we were talking about in terms of the erosion of the family. And we talked about, even in the last video we did last week, we talked about the communist view of the family, which basically said that the state bring up the children.
Yeah. It's breaking down the faith, it's breaking down the religion, it's breaking down the sexes, it's breaking down the morality, it's breaking everything down piece by piece by piece in the state-sponsored education program.
Yep.
So kids won't know if they're boys or
It is,
girls, they
yeah.
won't have any faith, they won't have family values. It's just every parent should be very angry about this.
So we get into the too new, too old, the YouTube videos. And I guess the first video is along the same theme that we've been talking about, free speech, censorship, and the threat of totalitarianism. So very applicable to Ireland right now. And this particular video from the Academy of Ideas. Now, the Academy of Ideas is a very good YouTube channel, and I would highly recommend it. They've got a very lot of good videos on this same kind of thread. This one is focused on censorship and, hate speech legislation and that kind of thing. And it actually features quotes from our own Gerard Casey. Now, the next video is very explicitly relating to Ireland, and it's why Ireland is poorer than you think. Kind of an interesting video. It's only 4 minutes long. It's a short video. But it talks about the situation in Ireland, that there's kind of a false view of the Irish economy, which is not reflected in the ordinary person on the street in terms of money in people's pockets, people's ability to buy houses, etc. Yet it looks like we've got this enormous GDP per capita, $106,000 per person. And that's not a reflection of reality. So this video talks about that. And it also talks about the amount of money that the government are spending, and particularly the amount of money being spent on the NGO sector. So it highlights that whole issue of, the 6+ billion that's been spent on the NGO sector, and what are we getting in return for it. This is an Academy of Ideas video, and it's comparing the 1984 book to the Brave New World book. Now, one of the points made in the book, which is kind of important, it basically says that the adoption of hedonism in a society weakens a society. It weakens people. It means people are no longer using their critical thinking. They're no longer being able to have proper objectivity. They're much easier to manipulate through the media and through commercialism. So, once you become a hedonistic society like that, you are a weaker society, and you're ripe for totalitarianism. Mm-hmm. And I guess this is the concern about indoctrination in the curriculum, which is kind of bringing in hedonistic elements into the curriculum. We know that from the sexuality perspective. And then also dumbing down the curriculum. So you're being dumbed down so that you don't critique things as much. You go along with the narrative that you're being sold, the government narrative, basically, and you don't cause any trouble. Another YouTube video talking about the Irish economy and the kind of leprechaun economics, I guess, is the term being used, because it's kind of not a real economy. So again, it's another one making those, that we've got a lot of issues in the country that aren't getting resolved, not getting any better. And we should be flush with cash. We should be able to solve these issues much quicker than we're doing so. But things just seem to be getting worse. So again, another video on that topic. Websites of the week. The first one was recommended actually by one of our viewers, wokeaware.org. Which covers a lot of topics, woke related topics, talks about the various ideologies and things like that, things like critical theory and all of that. So
thanks to Stephen for recommending this.
So
anyone else has any recommendations, just send us an email and we'll make sure we cover it in our next discussion.
No, it's good to share this stuff, and I know we have a backlog of various links we need to share. The next one is one as well that's from a kind of a similar sort of website. It's maybe slightly different. It's Logan Lansing. So Logan Lansing is one of the authors of The Queering of the American Child, and his website is It's Not in Schools. And that's basically the reference that people are always making. Oh, well, they don't teach that in school. That couldn't be happening in school. And basically he's saying, yeah, the gaslighting is over. It is in schools. They are teaching critical race theory. They are teaching gender theory in the schools. And this is going to be Irish schools, right? So pretty well everything he refers to here is going to be applicable to Irish schools, unfortunately. I wish it wasn't, but it's going to be.
Be an inspector there with a clipboard to monitor your child's teacher to make sure that this does go in.
Yeah. There's a whole enforcement campaign being introduced now. So the book of the week, we talked about it, Brave New World, from Aldous Huxley. Came from 1932. This book's a really old book, and it's set in what they call New London, and everybody's happy. It's this utopian society. Well, I'd call it dystopian, but some people might call it a utopia. There's peace and stability. Monogamy is banned, so you've got to have sex with everybody. There's no privacy. There's no money. We talked about cashless society. There's no money here. There's no family. You don't have any brothers, sisters, mothers, or fathers. And to keep people happy, you have to take these soma pills, these drugs that kind of calm you and prevent you from kind of going off the rails. So it's the Brave New World. It's this I say, dystopian society, very controlled, very technical, and artificial. Birth is all artificial. Children are raised by the state. It's a hedonistic society, as I said. We'll have sex with anybody, kind of thing. People are actually genetically engineered, so they engineer different classes of people as well. So it's pretty scary. Like, everything is controlled by the state. Basically, you have very little autonomy, very little control. But it's an interesting book to read in the context of where Ireland is going right now.
For anyone who didn't know this is all going on, it's quite a red pill for the state of Ireland. And, we talk about the, nearly 11,000 abortions a year. There's going to be euthanasia, surrogacy. You can buy your baby, even if you're a sex offender. You'll be silenced if you disagree with all of this. So all of the legislation that the state is pushing through these establishment parties is leading us to exactly what you referenced in the book, The Brave New World. And living in a world like that would be an absolute dystopian nightmare. I can't think of anything worse. So for everyone listening tonight, thanks for tuning in. Myself and Eugene are going to have a few weeks little rest after a very busy year, take some time off for the summer holidays. So if you haven't watched our previous weekly wrap-ups, just to let everyone know, they are on the Natural Women's Council YouTube. So you can catch up on the playlist for those last 4 weeks. So in wrap up, just a reminder that we are often shadow banned because we discuss things that go against the agenda. So if you can like the YouTube and comment on it and share it out, it does beat that algorithm, and share it out with everyone so we can make sure we get this content out that we've spent a lot of time, Eugene, yourself, researching, so we can make sure we get the views. Is there anything else you want to cover tonight before we sign off for the summer?
No, that's great, Jana. As I say, just people send us your comments, any suggestions, and when we get back, we have a lot of things to cover when we get back, so we'll be get ready to go. But any suggestions you send in the meantime, obviously we'll keep those in mind for the future episodes.